So I've got an idea about why it is that the government and the Westminster classes want to hide this information. Forgetting about, just leaving aside for one moment their ideology about mass migration and the sort of globalist mindset, but why is it that they're hiding information like this? And if you saw in Germany, one German politician, I think, got certainly booked, but maybe even prison time for releasing data on Afghan rapes within Germany. But my theory is that after the war, 1947 is the beginning of mass migration into Britain. And famously, that's the date of the Windrush first coming here, but actually there were a lot more Europeans coming here. And within 10 years, you have the first race riots in Britain.
Yeah,
Nottingham and Notting Hill. And over this, and then you have the British Nationality Act, you have the Race Relations Act, and the Race Relations Act, I think, is just after Notting Hill. But essentially, the Race Relations Act is the beginning of this, not just accretion of acts and laws to deal with the social problems of different groups living amongst each other, but it also breeds the culture. So then there's this culture of like, we have to deal with the best way to deal with the problem of these different groups coming together is acts and kind of hiding the truth about what's going on.
Absolutely. It's controlling the supply of information. That's what's happening. So we now have a layer of censorship that is put on top of our immigration debate. Okay, so non-crime hate incidents, right, where people are basically warned off talking about issues to do with migration. We have 250,000 of those over the last decade. Definitions of Islamophobia. The 2018 definition of Islamophobia signed off by the Labour Party and Liberal Tories specifically mentioned discussing the rape gangs and Muslim entryism into the institutions as examples of Islamophobia. The expansion of terms like far right, like hate, all of this is designed to discredit and delegitimize people like me from entering into this conversation and challenging the status quo. People have to understand that is basically what this is about. You saw it most notably after Southport, when Keir Starmer basically said, if you're asking questions about why these people are in your country or mass immigration, you're far right. If you ask questions about the rape gang inquiry, you're jumping on the bandwagon of the far right, or you're blowing a dog whistle, as Labour MP Lucy Powell said. This is the dominant mindset on the left. So they're trying to control the supply of information and narrow the public square. The difference today, of course, unlike the 1980s and 90s, is we now have new media. We have shows like this, we have podcasts, we have new television channels, we have Substacks, where you can basically circumvent the legacy institutions. The BBC doesn't control the national conversation anymore, right, in a way that it once did. The legacy institutions don't. Now, that's why the elite class are getting scared. That's why you're seeing the expansion of non-crime hate incidents, parents being arrested by 6 police officers because they're complaining about their school in WhatsApp groups. It's why you're seeing Lucy Connolly going to prison for the best part of 3 years, while 2 young lads, the Singh brothers or relatives in Preston, 2 young delivery drivers who went into the home of a 14-year-old girl and sexually assaulted her, were given 2.5 years. We now live in a society where they get a shorter sentence than somebody like Lucy Connolly, who shares some, challenging, hurty words on Twitter. It's all about trying to control the supply of information because I think the elite class is struggling.
So that's
it's about power.
Yeah, now we're into 2-tier justice in Britain, right? Because they're not just trying to hide things from people. They're actually treating different demographics within Britain completely differently. And
They're trying to manage. They are trying to manage the unmanageable now. That's what it is about. So they are trying to do sort of stakeholder management.
Wait, are you suggesting that they're getting more lenient jail time, prison sentences to people of minority backgrounds?
Well, we know what's happening.
But I know that they're doing it, but are you saying they're doing it because if they keep it down, it will be better for race relations?
It's stakeholder management. They are trying to manage irreconcilable differences among groups. They are trying to and this will only last for so long, but they are trying to dampen down the tensions by being more favourable and lenient to some groups over others. That's why Labour refused to budge on the rape gangs, because it knew that it would alienate its electoral support among British Muslim communities. It's why Keir Starmer, and to be frank, any mainstream politician, is unwilling to have a very frank conversation with the country about mass migration. Even when Keir Starmer gave his Island of Strangers speech, which, by the way, more than half of all British people, according to YouGov, said, yeah, I agree with that.
I think he's backtracked on it.
I agree with that. He's now regretted it. He said, well, actually, I shouldn't have said that, because they are terrified, actually, of acknowledging the reality that is around them, which is that this experiment is failing and it's dividing our country. And Winston, here's the thing. What we have seen in the UK over the last 20 years is just the beginning. If you look at the forecasts of where we're going, white Britons will be a minority by 2063. That will be much sooner, by the way, among the under 40s, somewhere around 2050. The foreign-born and their immediate children will be a majority by 2079. And we've just had some really shocking statistics that reflect that. 40% of all babies born in England today are born to at least one foreign-born parent.
Yeah, including me, by the way.
And we'll come back and discuss that. And by the end of the century, approaching 1/4 of all people in the UK will be following Islam, and potentially 1/3 of young people. The pace and scale of demographic, cultural, and religious change in this country is going to be like nothing the UK and its people have ever seen before. And I am one of the few people, I think, who's openly saying, I'm very nervous about this because I think this is going to be a disaster unless we change course. I don't think we're going to be able to unify this country. I don't think we're going to be able to uphold the social contract. I don't think people in politics and power are even thinking about what this is really going to mean for our communities and our country. It's not about, race. It is about what makes a viable nation state. Robert Putnam, the Harvard professor, once said, and he showed this empirically, if you subject nation states to rapid demographic change, to large-scale migration, the first thing that goes is social trust. Social trust collapses. People don't become, their trust in the institutions falls off a cliff. And what Putnam said is, in that situation, people hunker down. They turn away from their neighbors because suddenly their country doesn't look like their home anymore. It looks like a 2-star cheap motel where people are coming and going and you don't really know your neighbors. You certainly don't have a shared sense of history and collective memory with them. You don't have a shared identity with them. There's no common culture or way of life. Now, in that situation, is it your home anymore? Or is it actually something that you don't really enjoy being in and you certainly don't want your family to be in? Well, I would argue, that's where we're heading, given the underlying demographic changes that are now sweeping through this country.
So people are also suggesting that civil war might be on the horizon. David Getz is a famous proponent.
David Betts.
Is famously had a conversation on Louise Perry's podcast, which went extremely viral, making the case and kind of getting the impression that that's implicit in what you're saying. But maybe I'm wrong. Do you think that's a risk?
Well, what David Betts, and he's a professor, fellow professor, academic, what he's arguing is that actually, if you look at the literature and the evidence on civil wars and conflicts in developing nations, where they've been more frequent, more common, if you look at the factors that lead to civil war and conflict, I think I'm right in saying what David is arguing is those factors are now very visible in the UK. And he has said on the record that actually, the wheels are in motion. Things have already gone to such a place that it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to pull back. What he's saying is there's a 2-dimensional conflict or challenge that's now going on in this country. On the one hand, you have a fraying relationship between the people in power and the people they claim to represent, right? That the elites no longer really understand or even like the people that live around them, right? They're no longer in touch with the voters. But there's another dimension, which is growing evidence of inter-ethnic conflict. And you saw that during, for example, the riots in Leeds. You saw it in the aftermath of Southport. You see it in the organisation of gang violence in parts of London and elsewhere, even Southend-on-Sea, where you have tribalism, a kind of ethnic mobilization that you would expect to see in places like Lebanon, not the UK.
Yeah.
Now, I would even add to that by saying, firstly, yes, I think David Betts has a point, but I would add something else to that. People always say to me, well, you talk about the changing demography of the UK. Why do you think it matters? The rise of people who are born outside of the UK, for example. Well, if you look at the most common countries that non-UK born mothers who are having children in the UK are coming from, it's not Australia or Canada. It's not even really Europe. It's places like Iraq, Albania, Afghanistan, Pakistan, culturally different, if not incompatible nations. Why does that matter? Well, academics like Garrett Jones have shown that through migration, you get cultural transplant. So cultures transplant into those nations because migrants often tend to hold on to their cultural norms, their traditions, and their habits and their religious beliefs, and they pass them down to second, third generation. And what Garrett Jones says is, well, look, that can go really well. Sometimes it can have positive effects. It can leave good things, like, let's say, maybe a controversial point, but the Brits who settled in other nations, actually one of the things they left behind were really strong, well-functioning, effective institutions.
If you look at Hong Kong or Singapore, that totally supports that.
Now, compare that to, say, the Spanish and the Portuguese. Well, when they settled, they left very different things, lower levels of trust, ineffective institutions. But what Garrett Jones, I think, is saying, and what David Betts is saying is, now look at some of the things that are being culturally transplanted into the UK. The Pakistani Muslim rape gangs is the most obvious example, where you have a clan-based network from outside of the UK, deeply misogynistic attitudes towards women and girls being transplanted in. Mm-hmm. What about how folks from parts of Africa are very distrustful of the institutions and have low levels of trust being transplanted in? So if you look at the places that are at the forefront of these changes, so let's take Luton. If you remove London, Luton has the highest share in the entire country of babies who are being born to one or both parents who themselves were born outside of the UK. Here's my question. Do you want the UK, do you want the United Kingdom to look like Luton? That's the question. Everybody now needs to think about that question, because all of the things that you see now unfolding in Luton, in Slough, in parts of London, in Brent, in Ealing, those are now cascading out to other parts of the country that will also experience very similar cultural and demographic changes. Mm-hmm. Now, the left will say, diversity is our strength, migration leads us to paradise. Does Luton look like paradise to you? Does Luton look like the kind of place that you want the UK to look like?